All right, and I think we will get started. So it is my great pleasure to introduce Tony D'Amato. Tony and I have a very special connection. He's really pretty much why I'm here. Tony was my master's advisor at the University of Minnesota, but has since moved on to the University of Vermont, where he's continued his incredible research on silviculture from the department there, and closer to home in our home region of New England. So I'll let Tony describe all the great work he's doing. He's involved with just about anything you can imagine that relates to silviculture and forestry. And thank you so very much, Tony, for joining us remotely in these strange times.
Thanks, Emily, and thanks, folks, for that opportunity to present. And as Emily mentioned, she did work with me in her master's, and so you can imagine the pain you're in for over the next 45 minutes, because she doesn't do anything with silviculture now, and so clearly my influence on her pushed her into great things in the human dimensions. And so be prepared to also be excited about social sciences at the end of this. But in all seriousness, really amazing that we'll get to watch Emily and all she does at Michigan State, and so it's fun to get introduced by a former student. And what I'll be doing today is just talking a bit about some of the work that we've been doing, and more broadly, just some of the ideas that have been bandied about as it relates to addressing the challenges that face our forests, both in terms of climate change, but also in terms of invasive insects and diseases, changing disturbance regimes. And so I'll get into talking a bit about some of the research that has been happening both in the Lake States and the Northeast that I've been involved with that really fits into this broad category called silviculture for adaptation. So trying to really change what we're doing, or at least kind of manage in a way that is trying to be forward-thinking as it relates to all of these stressors that are coming our way. But before I get into that, I want to at least start by just talking a bit about some context for adaptation, kind of how have we adapted in the past, and how has it been effective in terms of influencing how we approach management and translating some of these ideas into on-the-ground actions that have now become, at least in our part of the world, a bit common. And so I mentioned to Deb when we were talking that I had a picture of an insect. I guess I now realize I have a picture of two insects in my talk, because I have some beach scale as well in this presentation. So double brownie points with the entomology crowd here. But what I want to do before I get into talking about kind of current stressors is just at least relay a bit of kind of experience here in the Northeast as it relates to a pretty dramatic adaptation as it relates to our management of northern hardwoods in the Northeast. And so this map on the left is just showing kind of the progression of beech scale, which introduced scale insect that's part of the beech bark disease complex that now many of you are quite familiar with. But it's really been a major presence in the Northeast really since the early 1900s, and so introduced in Halifax, Nova Scotia in the 1890s, and really influencing much of where I work beginning in the 30s and well through the 60s. And so a major change to a species that really, based on the historic surveys, was the most common species in the Northeast. And so unfortunately for many of you, you're now just witnessing kind of the onslaught of this in the Lake States. But this is a complex that's really been something we've been adapting to for almost a century, depending on where you are in the Northeast. And so what generally occurs is we take this beautiful smooth bark beech, kind of functioning as a big part of our forest. And once we have this complex moving into an area, it really changes the ecology of that species and how it exists in the landscape. And so when we look at beech in forests in the Northeast, and not to frighten those that are now experiencing this a bit in the UP and other parts of Michigan, generally what we often find in areas that are heavily impacted by beech bark disease is the development of these conditions here, where we have these really dense beech thickets underneath declining beech. And really what this results from, those that are familiar with the ecology of American beech, the most shade-tolerant hardwood species we have in our forests. And so the beech bark disease complex, causes that beech to experience stress, it sprouts, and it creates this really challenging condition from the perspective of managing for other values and other species in the landscape. And so beginning really in the 40s and 50s, folks really adapted their management to a dramatically novel stressor in our landscape, something that really was not kind of part of our natural disturbance regime. And what they began picking up on was that in these areas where we have beech bark disease, and more importantly, a heavy beech component, if we do what was being recommended as traditional management for northern hardwoods, which is single tree selection, very similar to what would be recommended in Michigan, we generate these very homogeneous, pure beech conditions. We almost play into that beech bark disease complex by creating very fine scale disturbances that really just favor beech suckering. And so create this very homogeneous stand condition totally dominated by a species of very little commercial value, even though certainly has high ecological value for bear and other species. And so what managers and more importantly, scientists began picking up on was that, using management guidelines that really were based on, to be honest, Aaron Zilgit, Arpergast, and some of these ideas around single tree selection, didn't quite fit for this context. And what they really decided was to come up with this novel technique, which was to, instead of removing single trees, rocket science here, it is silviculture, let's create larger patches. So areas, third acre, half acre in size. And in those areas, we will not only remove the mature trees, we'll remove everything, including all the existing advanced regeneration of beech. And what this generates in our landscape, from a regeneration perspective, is an incredibly diverse mix of species, including yellow birch, which is much easier in our landscape to manage than in the lake states, cherry species, birch, aspen, and really flips the composition of this forest towards something that much more from economically and ecologically is a desirable condition. And so if you were to walk with any manager in the Northeast today and ask, how do you deal with beech bark disease? How do you manage forests that have a heavy beech component? They'll immediately start talking about patch selection and kind of the ability of this approach to work quite well. And so even though we don't think about this as an adaptation technique relative to how we think about adaptation now in terms of climate change, we've already dramatically shifted how we manage northern hardwoods, at least in the northeastern region, in response to this. And so I'm going to get into talking about kind of how we approach adaptation now, kind of in the more 21st century model around climate change and other stressors. But there's a lot that can be learned both from this work and certainly as well as from work that has been done in other areas as it relates to how do you adapt to changes and how do you do it in a way that affects what happens on the ground. And one key thing about the work that was done looking at patch selection as it relates to adapting to beech bark disease was that it recruited a species, yellow birch, that economically many of us get excited about, but also ecologically has a lot of value in the system. Likewise, a lot of the work that was done to develop these techniques, similar to places like the Duke's Experimental Forest in Argonne, where you have multiple scientists and stakeholders looking at things, a lot of this work was done with wildlife biologists and silviculturists demonstrating the value of these techniques to not just yellow birch, which of course is always the priority, but also bird species and other attributes. It also factored in what was operationally feasible. We weren't going to go out there and pull out every beech stem, really doing it in a way that could fit into kind of general operations. And most importantly, this is not done on every single northern hardwood site. Really, a lot of the work that was done to develop this by Bill Leake, similar to the work that Kotar and others have done with habitat typing in the lake states, really focused in on, if you want people to adopt this, you need to think about how site quality and habitat type affects outcome. And so a site like this on the right, where it's clearly a rich site, they're not going to do patch selection. They're going to do single tree selection for sugar maple based on those conditions. And so as we move into thinking about adapting to global change, a lot of these takeaways in terms of it being operational, fitting with multiple benefits, certainly being tailored to local conditions are equally important if we want to have impact on a wider landscape. Ironically, when we get into talking about adaptation, and certainly those that possibly looked at the title of the talk or at least logged on and were like, oh, this is what I have to deal with now, potentially your brain went to, well, now we're going to talk a lot about assisted migration because we're talking about silviculture and we're talking about adaptation. And really, a lot of the popular press, particularly in the lake states, as well as there are some examples in these stories as well from the northeastern US, when they talk about climate change and they talk about silviculture, at least the stuff that makes it to the Washington Post and makes it to the New York Times, a lot of it really revolves around finding the right tree species to plant in the right place and do it in a way that can allow us to engineer the forest to get us out of this grand challenge that's climate change and some of the other stressors we're facing. And so there's really this general notion that when it comes to silviculture for adaptation, it really boils down to, where should I put that white oak seedling or red oak seedling, or what should I move where and how much, and really thinking about it from the perspective of planting the forest of the future, as has been implied in this Nature article from about a decade ago. But what's critical relating back to the operational feasibility, and I certainly will talk a lot about planting trees today towards the end, but we really already know from some pretty good examples, both here in the US and around the globe, that it's infeasible for us to plant our way out of this issue, both from a nursery capacity perspective, from an investment perspective, as well as just from a prevailing management culture perspective. We are not going to re-engineer the forest, let alone just from a humility perspective. We know we don't know what's right solution perfectly right now on the landscape. And so as a point of reflection and as a bit of a rebuttal towards these ideas of us being able to plant our way out of this, I've just pulled a figure from a nice review paper that Tom Fox did in the early 2000s on kind of the rise of southern pine silviculture in the Southeast. And what this figure is just showing is just beginning in the 50s and all the way into early 2000s, the mass conversion of the southern landscape into the large industrial forest landscape that we often associate with the southeastern U.S. now. And even though we view this as a mass transformation of that landscape, it was only 17% of all possible timberland was converted to plantations. And that was during a time period where people actually would invest in industrial timber practices. So this was all underwritten by industry, and nonetheless, they only changed 17% of the landscape. And so again, my reason for showing this is a very important point of reflection. When we talk about climate adaptation, and we talk about planting the right tree species in the right place, it's going to need to fit in with a broader package of strategies that aren't necessarily going to be based solely on nursery capacity and planting trees in the landscape. And so what I'm going to do is talk about what's been learned from observing adaptation in practice based on the climate change response framework that many of you I know are familiar with through the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, and then get into some of the science that's being done to try to at least look at how does placing the right trees in the right place at the right time fit into a broader suite of adaptation silviculture that might not always look like a plantation of future adapted species. So as many of you are already familiar with and likely have been involved with, there's a tremendous resource, particularly in the lake states and Northeast. We're quite spoiled to have the efforts of NIACs and associated partners in generating, really relative to any other part of the country and really any part of the globe, a huge resource to look at when it comes to how managers have taken the threat of climate change, taken the threat of emerald ash borer, taken the threat of oak wilt, and integrated into on-the-ground actions. And so again, I recognize this is old hat to many of you, but what I'm showing here on the left is just the location of different demonstration areas that the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science has produced with managers and other stakeholders, with the goal being to integrate kind of climate change planning into the objectives for that site, as well as to integrate that into kind of on-the-ground actions that are designed to try to respond to change and adapt that practice. And so a couple of years ago, Todd Ontel with NIACs did a deep dive into looking at what are some of the things that are common across these different case studies, as well as what can we learn in terms of how folks are operationalizing adaptation on the landscape. And so I'm going to use the terms resistance, resilience, and transition a heck of a lot throughout this presentation. And again, I realize many of you are familiar with this, but generally when I'm talking about resistance strategies from a silvicultural standpoint, really we're trying to do things from a management perspective that are going to increase the defense of that forest to climate change or insects and diseases, with the intent really to try to maintain that forest in its current condition. And so this is going to be kind of our highest input and really our most kind of a near-term versus long-term strategy for adaptation. Moving along that spectrum, we have resilience, kind of the word of the decade. And so resilience, what we're talking about there is that we're managing that forest. We still have some desired range of conditions that we're managing for, often based on the historic range of variation, but that we're doing things to basically accommodate some change and try to build in mechanisms for that forest to be able to respond and return back or stay within that range of variation. Then finally, moving down the spectrum to transition, in this case, we're actually shifting that forest in some way towards a condition that we view would be future adapted based on climate conditions, insects and diseases. So using our best knowledge of the future to try to shift that forest towards that condition. And so I just present these as discrete classes, but really these are additive and kind of build off of one another as we move along this continuum. And so looking at both kind of upper northern lake states region, so the Laurentian mixed forest province, and then central interior broadleaf forest, we evaluated how many projects fell within these different categories. And so overall, the majority of managers were doing something that really represented some element of resilience. If you look at the Laurentian mixed forest province, so northern lake states region, that was definitely the majority of approaches, whereas in the central interior, so kind of down in the Ozarks and other regions, kind of the more central hardwood forest, many of the approaches that folks were using were called transition. I'll talk in a minute about kind of why that ends up being much more common down in that landscape. And so if we look at the actual strategies that managers are using when they actually take this idea of adapting to climate change, or again, it's not just climate change, as I'll mention in a moment, it's also a lot of biological stressors. What are they actually doing to deal with that? And so one of the main approaches in the Laurentian mixed forest province, and you can hear my biological stress from my dog maybe barking in the background there. This is my biological stress relief. He's a good dog. What we're looking at here is much more in the Northern Lake States region. Managers are prioritizing and doing approaches that were trying to minimize the impacts of some sort of biological stressor, and it's no coincidence. Just given, again, we have Deb on the call here. We know Michigan, as well as other parts of the Lake States region, have a long history, as well as in the last couple of decades, of non-native insects and diseases being introduced, and becoming a major objective for managers is how do we minimize those impacts, either by reducing host abundance or other strategies. What also was very common in the Northern Lake States region in terms of how managers were approaching climate change adaptation was that they were doing a lot to enhance species and structural diversity. And so again, you all are very familiar with the landscapes out there in terms of kind of the historic land use and the impact that had on homogenizing much of the Lake States forest. And so a lot of what managers are doing now in the name of adaptation really is using techniques, primarily ecological silviculture approaches and other approaches, to try to kind of increase the complexity of what is a highly simplified system just based on the great cutover and the history of land use legacies in that landscape. In contrast, if we look at kind of the central interior region, so again, really in the heart of that central hardwood region, a lot of that transition that I mentioned being most predominant in this region is not how we think about transition, where we're shifting to some future adapted condition. In actuality, a lot of what managers are doing in this region is kind of restoring what they view as a much more natural condition on that landscape, which are these open woodland-like conditions, and certainly parts of Michigan have these as well, that have become much denser over time due to fire exclusion, in some cases increases in precipitation over the past couple of decades. And so restoring kind of those woodland conditions as a transition to kind of manage for those systems. But when we look at kind of the general approaches that managers are using, even though we talk about transition here in the context of shifting back to a different structure, there's very little example of managers really thinking outside the box in terms of introducing new species and using novel strategies. And in general, if we look at this kind of in a conceptual framework, much of what's happening right now in terms of adaptation silviculture is still working within kind of our own understanding of the historic range of variation, both in forest conditions, as well as our own comfort level with the silvicultural strategies and management techniques that we typically use. And so those approaches, like transitioning to different species and shifting that ecosystem to a different state, really most managers are reluctant, and we'll talk more about this in a little bit, to move into that space, given in some they're not facing this undesirable threshold or tipping point that's going to force their hand to start thinking way outside the box that they're comfortable with. And so to address kind of that space, and more importantly, address trying to develop some more robust operational scale understanding of adaptation, the Adaptive Silviculture for Climate Change project was established almost a decade ago now as a way to start installing in various locations large-scale experiments that can really expand upon the approach used for that climate change response framework, but do it in a way that's statistically robust and really is done so that we can replicate and test different strategies at a single site so as to hopefully inform future adaptation actions in the region. And so I recognize, again, many are already familiar with this project, but just to kind of point this out, it's a large multi-institution project led by Linda Nagel at Colorado State, as well as with folks at the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science. So there's a series of experiments, two kind of in the Northern Forest region that they kind of consider kind of these network sites. So one at the Second College Grant in Northern New Hampshire, where I work primarily, as well as Chippewa National Forest. And it's now, I guess, an international study because there's sites in Ontario now, as well as discussion for other regions. But the goal being to really install these large-scale operational experiments that allow us to look at adaptation outcomes in a way that can both kind of see how managers are thinking about adaptation, but more importantly, test some of these more novel experimental techniques that might not be easily implemented in managers' day-to-day operations. So I'm going to talk through kind of how the adaptive silviculture for climate change experiments are designed. And really the reason for doing this is so folks can get a better handle on just how are we bringing in that manager experience as well as that operational scale nature into what we're doing. And so The adaptive silviculture for climate change experiment really is a co-produced experiment. And remember, again, I recognize many folks are familiar with the co-production process, but instead of me sitting in my office, or more likely, I'm sitting at my dining room table, which is where I mainly work these days, and coming up with some experimental treatment and then shopping it out to managers and saying, this is how we should manage the forest. Instead, we're doing this with the manager as a partner and groups of managers as partners from the beginning. And so really talking through kind of what their experiences are, what their objectives are, and really localizing it to both their knowledge as well as to kind of how they feel about given resources and outputs on that site. And so for each of these sites, workshops are held, basically including a range of managers and scientists. We talk through kind of what are the projected impacts for that site, both in terms of climate change and forest health, and then actually get out in the forest and talk through kind of, if we were to do management here, what are some of the constraints, both socially, economically, as well as ecologically, that we need to factor into that. And so really trying to localize this and make it fit within the objectives of a manager, similar to what the climate change response framework does. So I'll just talk through briefly kind of how these treatments are designed, because what I'm going to be doing in a moment is summarizing kind of what have been some kind of general trends and how these treatments have been designed at each installation. But the adaptive silviculture for climate change experiment really is testing kind of those three different categories of adaptation, so resistance, resilience, and transition, as well as a no management strategy, which is kind of letting it change, the forest change naturally. And so for each of those conditions, really what happens is that managers and scientists talk through, if you were to manage this forest to resist climate change, what do you think the forest would look like from a desired future condition standpoint? How would you actually manage for that condition? And kind of what would you do over time to kind of either maintain or shift that condition depending on the overall objectives? And so picking on northern hardwoods, because that's both overlaps with your world as well as mine. If we look at kind of the resilience treatments for the installation in northern New Hampshire, kind of the general desired future condition is that we want to have multiple combinations of species and structure. So giving that ecosystem at least many pathways to recover back to some range of variation following, insect outbreak or an ice storm or a drought or some other extreme event. And so if I want to kind of manage for resilience, kind of what am I looking for in terms of conditions on that site? And so what we might do through our management actions is increase kind of the abundance of species that are resistant to different disturbance events or can adapt and respond to those events, like drought adaptation or ice resistance, and really trying to maintain a range of habitats and resource environments to have kind of multiple pathways even for different species to persist on that site over time. This is the part that made Emily run with the social scientist realm, get into the nuts and bolts of silviculture. And so if we wanted to actually generate that resilience condition, how do we actually do that on the ground? And so using, in this case, some semblance of a variable density thinning, or producing gaps for new regeneration, and really favoring certain species that have traits like yellow birch and red spruce that we view as future adapted, as well as leaving some areas behind, thinning others, and trying to create a complexity of condition across that landscape. And so for each of these treatments and each of these sites, these are being kind of localized and talked through with managers as to what they want to have happen. So what I'm going to do is talk about just some of the commonalities and differences that have come out of this as managers and scientists have kind of talked through how do you resist climate change at a given site, how do you kind of manage for resilience and so forth. And so I'm going to build on some synthesis that Linda Nagel did as it relates to kind of the constellations of sites that exist out there. And so adding a bit more detail to some of these sites, so the Flathead National Forest, so those of you familiar with this landscape, so Western Larch Mixed Conifer Forest, certainly areas of the country where we're concerned about drought, fire, decreasing snowpack. Similarly, the San Juan, very similar suite of concerns, although even more kind of dry and more woodland type condition. Most are very familiar with kind of red pine systems to the lake states, again, drought and fire being some of the concerns. Moving to the southeast, again, thinking about drought, but also things like sea level rise, just given kind of what's happening in the coastal plain region. And then finally, kind of in the northeast, kind of where drought's less of a concern, but more focus on invasive species and other attributes. And so I'm going to go through kind of some summaries as it relates to what are just some common features as well as differences that have come out as managers and scientists have articulated kind of what is a resistance strategy, what's resilience, what's transition, and how do we manage for that. And so if we look at resistance strategies, depending on what site I'm at, those forests that exist in regions of the country where drought and fire is an impact the primary silvicultural technique that kind of a resistance strategy boils down to is thinning. So it really focuses on increasing the vigor of the residual stand that exists in the site. And so using thinning treatments like this thinning on the Chippewa National Forest to basically minimize the level of drought stress as well as reduce the fuel loading in that ecosystem. So really focused on kind of keeping that pine dominance and not really doing much else beyond influence resource availability. In a northern hardwood ecosystem, a bit different in that drought's less of an issue, in those ecosystems, and certainly something that's less thought of as a primary stressor. And so in terms of resisting change, much of the focus really shifted on using regeneration harvests in the context of these forests, single tree selection, as a way to maintain that northern hardwood dominance. And so when they talk about resistance in these ecosystems, it's less about drought and more about other climate extremes, particularly ice and wind. And so looking at an individual tree level, when marking individual trees, selecting trees like this, sugar maple, that has a crown form that's going to be more resistant to ice loading than one that would have a V-shaped crown form with included bark. So trying to choose kind of individual tree forms that are resistant, as well as, this isn't a big deal for many of you, it will be sadly in a couple decades, but if you see a beech like this, which in our forest is rare, that doesn't have beech bark disease all over it, selecting for those individuals and retaining those individuals to try to maintain and enhance the resistance of that ecosystem to that stressor. And so if we look at kind of the impact of drought and importance of drought, as well as snowpack across this region, it makes sense that obviously in these summit-area regions, people would view thinning as kind of a key tactic for dealing with resisting climate change. And just to draw that point home, I'm going to build on some work that we did looking at these long-term silvicultural experiments from different regions and actually looking historically at drought and how that was influenced by the density of the forest and kind of in the interaction between that and the drought event. So this panel here has 3 different experimental forests: Fort Valley, which I know some of you who spent time in Flagstaff are familiar with, in Arizona, Black Hills in South Dakota, and Cutfoot in Minnesota. And we just have an index of resistance to drought versus stand stocking, so kind of the overall density of that stand. So this is one example of a drought in 2002 from the 2 ponderosa pine dominated sites. And for both of those, we see pretty clearly as density of that forest goes up, the resistance of that forest to drought impacts goes down, right? So the higher the density, the more competition, and certainly more risk to other things like bark beetle. At the Cutfoot in Minnesota, in this case, there was less of an impact, although in some other work we've done, we've shown a pretty important influence of density on even drought response in Minnesota red pine, particularly during severe drought events. What you also saw when I was showing that constellation of sites is that declining snowpack is certainly a concern in the western sites. And so we've looked at some of these experiments and also evaluated how has historic snowpack influenced forest growth, and has that been important historically across different densities of trees on the same site. And so on the left panel, we have Birch Lake, which is a plantation in Minnesota that we've been working with for I guess 60 years now of data, not me 60 years, but the data. And then on the right is Fort Valley, again, ponderosa pine in Arizona. So if we look at historic forest growth versus kind of a modeled snow water equivalence, this is just kind of an index of snowpack. Generally, in the Minnesota sites, snowpack has really little influence on growth, and in some cases a slight negative impact, again, speaking to the fact that these forests are energy limited, right? So the longer the growing season, the better. And so a large snowpack can actually be a negative depending on kind of the other climate variables that come together in those ecosystems. Whereas if we look at an arid ecosystem like in Arizona, when we increase snowpack, growth is much greater in the following year. What we also found was that snowpack was most important to high density stands. And so not only does density matter in terms of growing season moisture in these ecosystems, but again, using thinning to kind of reduce densities is also important in terms of kind of reducing the dependency on snowpack in terms of growth. So with resilience strategies, again, there was a major difference depending on, in this case, the nature of the ecosystem, kind of the prevailing disturbance regime, as well as kind of the overall notion of those ecosystems in terms of their structure. And so several of the ecosystems, particularly the ponderosa pine and longleaf pine dominated systems, many would argue were more woodland-like conditions historically. So similar to as I reported for the climate change response framework work that Todd Ontel did, a lot of the resilience strategies in these ecosystems like longleaf pine really focused on restoring that ecosystem to much more open conditions, really favoring that signature species like longleaf pine or ponderosa pine. So much more of a restoration type approach. Whereas for the Great Lakes pine systems, as well as the northern hardwood systems, where we have much more variable disturbance regimes, tending much more towards closed canopy or at least variable conditions, a lot of the resilience strategies in those systems really focus much more on ecological silvicultural strategies that were designed to really increase heterogeneity in the environment, as well as recruit new species on that site to at least enhance the adaptive response to climate change. So people haven't heard me mention anything about assisted migration yet, and that's kind of what I led with as what anybody would think of when it comes to silviculture for adaptation. So I'm finally to transition and finally to the controversy and as it relates to adaptation silviculture. And as I mentioned in the slide here, this tends to be what people get most worked up about or excited about or interested in, is you're planting what species where and how does that fit in. But when we interface with managers, it's the least practiced, really very little application of assisted migration happening in the landscape, but certainly is one where, people often get most interested when it relates to climate change adaptation. But one thing that we've been doing and beyond kind of the on-the-ground silviculture research is that Emily will be happy to hear this, doing a lot of human dimensions research around this as well, to try to understand how managers are thinking about risk and thinking about adaptation in their landscape. And what we found is that most managers are not excited or willing to go into assisted migration, except for those managers that are facing or have experienced an undesirable tipping point or threshold. And so an example being, we've seen a tremendous amount of interest in application of underplanting of different species, in Minnesota in particular, in response to the threat that emerald ash borer poses to black ash forest. There's my second insect, Deb. And so, this is an undesirable transition. You lose forest from that site. If it shifts to a non-forested state, it's a condition that is quite undesirable. And so there's more acceptance of the potential for planting different species in these forests. And we've experienced similar things with Asian longhorn beetle in the Worcester region, where managers, again, are willing to plant many different species, given they've faced a tremendous undesirable tipping point as it relates to loss of urban tree cover due to that introduced insect. So when we talk about assisted migration, it's again generally controversial depending on the group that you're interfacing with, but there are many different flavors of assisted migration, and many of them are actually generally fairly benign relative to the ones that make the most news or certainly generate the most controversy. And so I'm just going to talk briefly about kind of the three different flavors of assisted migration that at least we tend to recognize as it relates to forest adaptation, and then talk a bit about kind of how those are informed and then what would have been some of the outcomes as it relates to these experiments in terms of planting different species in the landscape. And so the first category we call assisted population expansion. So really, this is not a mass movement across continents or even kind of an expansion of a range. Generally, we're talking about moving the same genotype, moving kind of a different genotype of the same species within kind of the range of that species. So it's not necessarily kind of a mass movement, it's just often kind of augmenting the local population of a given species in a given area. The next, and the one that gets the most attention as it relates to silviculture for adaptation, is this assisted range expansion. And so acknowledging that trees likely can't track the shifting climate that's happening naturally. Is there the ability to kind of shift kind of the range of those species to kind of align with where that future climate or the current climate is going to be better adapted to that tree species functionally requires? And so kind of shifting species northward, ever so westward, ever so eastward, very, very rarely southward, except maybe in the southern hemisphere. So trying to kind of anticipate those changes. And then finally, assisted species migration. This is where the most controversy is generated, but really is the least practiced now. Historically, we did a ton of assisted species migration, like this Norway spruce plantation, the Scots pine plantations, many of our arboretums, and moving things all over the globe. But this is less commonly practiced operationally from a silvicultural standpoint, but nonetheless is discussed as a way to think about kind of adapting future forests. And so in diagrammatic form, just to kind of review those, population expansion, again, we're staying within the current range of the species, just shifting potentially maybe a southern genotype or a genotype that might have resistance to a given stressor kind of within the current range. Range expansion, just ever so slightly kind of nudging that species northward or again westward in anticipation of tracking future climate. And then finally, species migration, kind of that mass movement. So if we bring this back to those three terms that you'll be hearing in your sleep tonight: resistance, resilience, and transition. and how assisted migration fits into these. This is a figure that Brian Palick worked up as a part of a paper in prep, where, in resistance strategies, very rarely are we thinking about assisted migration. There might be some population expansion focused primarily on maybe introducing genotypes that show resistance to a given stressor, like Dutch elm disease, chestnut blight. But generally, we're not thinking much about assisted migration with these resistance strategies. But as we get into resilience, again, most of what we're talking about is trying to increase the mechanisms of that forest to respond to climate, but return to some historic range of variation. And so generally what we're describing with planting and resilience strategies is just expanding populations of species currently present on site, so that are projected to be adapted to future conditions. So again, not mass movement. Transition, as the name implies, this is where we might be describing, shifting that forest compositionally to include a greater proportion of species that may be adapted to future climate conditions. And so this is where we include range of expansion, and in some cases, even species migration, depending on the application and what was happening in the landscape. And so really this has been a major change in thinking as it relates to silviculture, particularly in the North Woods region, where certainly we've done a lot of planting, particularly in the lake states. Here in the Northeast where I work, planting is a very minor part of silvicultural practice. But in general, this notion of planting and thinking through planting, and not only planting, but planting for the future, is quite recent relative to our long-term history in silviculture. And so what do we use to kind of inform this? And so this is a very busy slide, and I apologize, but to point out, there's many different things we use to inform it. And one of the key pieces of information that, again, I know many of you are familiar with is the climate change tree atlas that Lewis Iverson and his group have been leading, where they're looking at changes in climate envelopes and species distribution modeling to try to understand kind of how that niche might shift based on different climate regimes. So this recent paper by Lewis and his group just showing kind of the potential for new species. So both Michigan as well as the Northeast are poised based on kind of climate projections to gain suitable habitat for many different species into the future. Obviously, this is showing potential. The reality is a very different situation. Likewise, there's a lot of discussion about selecting the right seed lots. So if I'm working on the Green Mountain National Forest and I want to plant for a future climate, maybe based on the climate for what's going to happen in the year 2055, I might want to collect seed from this zone here, because that's going to be much more comparable to what this forest is going to experience in 2055. And so using seed collection zones as a way to think these through. And so another way that folks are informing this. Then another key piece to this that I won't get into too much in this presentation is also thinking through just the functional traits of the species that both exist in the forest that we currently are managing, as well as the ones that we might want to introduce into that forest. And so there's been a lot of work by Aubin and her group in Quebec to really look at functional traits and summarize species based on different functional traits. And this table in the lower right-hand corner just shows kind of groups of species based on some similar functional traits, both in terms of their ability either to cope with drought or respond to fire. And so using those as ways to inform, what species should we be putting out there if we're projecting to experience more fire or more drought, or want to have species with high migration potential across the landscape. So I'm going to get into just showing, some outcomes of kind of initial assisted migration work that's part of the transition treatments at two of the ASK sites, the Minnesota site and the New Hampshire site. And for both of these, I've kind of coded the assisted migration type. So is it population expansion? Is it range expansion? Species migration? And again, 3-year results, we all know, certainly, there's a blip in a forest life, but at least to give you kind of an idea of how things are playing out even initially, depending on the category of assisted migration. And so this is some work that Jacob Mueller wrote up as part of his PhD work. And in generally, kind of the species that are doing quite well in Minnesota as part of those transition treatments generally represent those that are either assisted population or range expansion. So really kind of the ones that are either based on kind of what's locally present on the site or shifting species just north into that region tend to be having kind of the highest rates of survival and growth. And those are, people are already furrowing their brow at ponderosa pine. Why would you plant ponderosa pine in Minnesota? The reasoning for this was functional. So those that are familiar with this landscape, there's really not another species that plays a similar functional role as red pine. And so the thinking, these were the managers and scientists in this team, was, can we introduce ponderosa pine as a potential replacement for red pine? And I would say that the answer so far has been no, in terms of pretty low survival of 4 different seed sources. But in this case, really showing kind of that local population expansion and range expansion have been most promising. In New Hampshire, it's a bit different. Really, what we've seen in this landscape when we've planted as part of the transition strategies in a northern hardwood ecosystem, most of the success has been with those species that primarily already exist in the landscape, and all we're doing with the planting is enhancing their population. And so, very different conclusion. And a lot of the range expansion that we're seeing, things like black birch, bitternut hickory, American chestnut, black cherry are doing quite poorly. If you look at the survival rates here relative to even what happened in Minnesota, they're all generally very low, but in particular for those species where we're really pushing their range. And so the challenge with a lot of these transition strategies is that we're informing kind of what to plant today based on a 100-year projection. And so all it takes is even what we're getting right now here, which is low snowpack, and then we're going to get a really cold day, and all those seedlings that aren't really used to being exposed to -10 are going to be quite vulnerable to that. And so there's a lot of risk built into this. The other thing that's worth pointing out, those that know your silvics are like red oak and red spruce, two very different species. And so ironically, that the two highest survivors occupy very different ends of the spectrum in terms of their functional adaptations. Red oak being very well adapted to drought, red spruce being much more of a maritime type species, really doing well in high precipitation. And so it's speaking to kind of what we're getting here in terms of precip regimes, but arguing for really trying this portfolio approach versus an individual, kind of just focusing on an individual projection. Finally, in terms of planting, this is what the weather was like for about a month, both the day after we started planting, leading and a month following that. And so we experienced what has become now in the past 3 years common, because it's happened twice, where we come out of a very wet spring and essentially have a month of very high drought conditions, followed by some moisture. And so the low survival we're seeing here is really reflecting, in some cases also, where we're planting into a very novel condition. One thing that's important to point out, though, is that when we're dealing with assisted migration and controversial decisions or trying to think outside the box, in some cases, we don't have a lot of experience in how do we operationalize using the landscape. And so the work that we've been doing with evaluating options for increasing the resilience of black ash forests that are threatened by emerald ash borer have been very different than we've been seeing in upland systems, where in general either population expansion or some species migration has been most effective for maintaining species. And so what we're looking at here are the survival rates after 8 years in northern Minnesota of different species we've planted as a strategy to really increase the resilience of black ash forests to emerald ash borer. And by far, kind of the species that have had the highest level of survival have been American elm. It's American elm crossed with local seed source crossed with Valley Forge variety, swamp white oak, which is not currently found in the landscape, so it's an example of a range expansion. Then Manchurian ash, which obviously is not found on the continent that we're doing this experiment. And so in the context of these 4 species, these are species that very likely we would not have considered if we really were focused primarily on just, working with local native species. But what we found is that those local native species that we've tried to plant and increase resilience have done really poorly on these sites. And so what we're now starting to see is that by, thinking outside the box, including some of this assisted migration that, may not have been as acceptable and probably still is not acceptable to some a decade ago, is actually providing some promise as a way to at least diversify these forests, particularly in the realm of swamp white oak being a species we've seen pretty high success for in other places outside the region. Those wondering about Manchurian ash and how dare I plant a non-native species in response to another non-native species, again, functionally, but from a cultural perspective, this species was chosen given some work that Mike Benedict with the Bureau of Indian Affairs had done, where they showed they actually could bang pound splints for basket making out of Manchurian ash. And so the notion was, can we plant an ash species that could still provide basket material in this landscape? And those worried about Manchurian ash, thankfully, it's not very frost tolerant. And so it survives, but it does not grow very far before dying back. So I've been talking a lot about kind of planting and increasing resilience of black ash forests. And again, Deb and some others on the webinar today know, I mean, there's so much forest out there, could I ever truly transform that in a way to kind of change the trajectory of those ecosystems? And I completely agree. And I think we run into this issue sometimes. And I pointed out at the beginning that A lot of the focus of what we're doing from an adaptation perspective, and a lot of the headlines and what the reporter wants to write about is they're planting red oak, in the middle of northern Minnesota in a place where it never was before. But, really that has to happen within both, again, the realities of our operations and the realities of our ownership. And so just as a quick example to drive that point home, we've been looking at, similar to what was done by Matthew Duvenick and Rob Scheller for parts of Michigan, where they showed, climate adapted planting can transform the forest. We've been looking at, if we integrate adaptation practices into what managers do on the landscape, can we actually shift and influence what that future forest might look like, over the next 100 years or so. And so focusing in on kind of central Vermont here, which I know not everybody's familiar with as landscape, but very similar to parts of Michigan, but with even less public land. So the majority of this is dominated by family forest owners, still, over 80% forested, but mostly family forest owners. And so when we think about like all the decisions they make and their willingness to even implement adaptation strategies that are novel and outside the box, there's not a huge excitement and acceptance of that. And so what we did was we kind of projected this landscape. So if we go from kind of the current landscape, which is dominated by sugar maple and beech, into the future, without doing anything different, we see it gets a little bit browner, a little bit more orange. So again, it's just sugar maple and beech being pretty darn dominant. But if we do things to try to kind of adapt that forest and integrate more southern species, don't adjust your dial. There's not a huge change in terms of future conditions between those two landscapes. And the reason being, we know that this landscape is not going to become like 100-acre, 200-acre block clear cuts being replanted with future adapted species. We have a diversity of landowners, a diversity of managers and their approaches. And so our ability and kind of the knobs that we have to turn are pretty limited in terms of adaptation. And so if we return back to kind of the adaptive silviculture for climate change experiment, if we look at just kind of structurally how these forests are being impacted by these treatments, we're not talking about a wholesale re-engineering of the forests. In many cases, we're going from closed canopy condition, whether it's in the sugar maple forest or red pine, and what we're looking at here is just a 1 hectare stem map in the middle of these units. Go to resistance, reducing the density, creating some potentially some complexity in structure. Resilience, again, still working with the existing trees. Now we're seeing canopy gaps, dense areas being left behind as patches. And then transition, many of these take some flavor of regular shelter wood, where primarily the adaptation strategies associated with planting are only occurring in kind of gap environment, but the remaining area of the forest is still being managed to try to work with the adaptive capacity those current species have. And so when we talk about kind of integrating adaptation into these ecosystems, it's working with that system, kind of building off of those structures and doing it in a way that both culturally but also ecologically makes a lot of sense. And so looking at it more from the perspective of just how these treatments array in a more continuous fashion using LiDAR, this is an example of a section of that experiment in New Hampshire where we have in yellow, this is the resistance treatments, in orange, unfortunate color choice, but this is the resilience. And then in pink, we have transition, and then in this blue is a portion of an unmanaged area. And so we're looking at canopy heights here, so kind of the hotter the color, the taller the trees. And so in resistance, you can see very fine scale single tree selection. Resilience, here's a landing, but in general, group selection mixed with some single tree selection. And then transition, basically, these continuous cover regular shelter woods where the planting is actually only occurring in these gaps. And so if we look at that planting more through the lens of how is that influencing the functioning of that forest over time and that landscape over time, as opposed to some mass reengineering the ecosystem, it's a much more constructive way to think about introducing these into what we're doing operationally in the landscape. And so how does that patch that now has red oak in it interact with other existing gaps and other existing structures across that landscape? And so using kind of adaptation plantings as part of this bigger picture that's really trying to enhance that functional connectivity across the landscape. And so to finish in terms of kind of broadening that, when we talk about adaptation and acceptance of adaptation and acceptance of assisted migration and all these novel plantings, it's not the first time there's been conflict of objective and discussion over how do we balance objectives and risk and investment across diverse landscapes. And so many are familiar with the triad concept that Bob Seymour and Mac Hunter came out with in the early 90s. It's been widely popularized, particularly in Quebec, but other parts of Canada, as a way to balance kind of biodiversity conservation with commodity production. And so the idea of the original triad was to kind of designate some areas as reserves and kind of counterbalance that loss of production with areas of intensive production. And then everywhere else is some shade of green, what we call extensive management or ecological forestry. And so the goal being to kind of balance the achievement of both wood production and biodiversity conservation across a wide region. And so as we think about adaptation and kind of the risk and the investment and also the acceptability socially across the landscape and operationally of this idea of deploying novel adaptation plantings, there's going to be a tremendous variation in who's willing to do that, as well as kind of the level of information to inform that. And so similar to the triad, as we think about kind of applying adaptation across this range of silviculture, it's not going to be wholesale reengineering with these novel plantations. It's can we strategically deploy in some areas these novel species mixtures that really can be key source populations going forward for other areas, while at finer scales maybe integrating some lesser amounts of future adapted planting in areas that are otherwise being managed with ecological silviculture, but doing this in a way to really enhance those functional connections and maximize the ability to kind of have multiple mechanisms across that landscape to adapt. So one final comment on this is that, I started out talking about bill leak and managing beech bark disease, and really, a lot of silviculture, as much as some run away from it after their master's thesis for other disciplines, a big part of it is it needs to be localized. And again, I know some of the work happening in Michigan, like Walter's group, looking at sugar maple regen, using habitat types and using the understanding of deer densities and all these things that really are going to influence the outcomes of adaptation are critical. And so when we think about silviculture for adaptation and having impact, like localizing that is the first key step. We can't just come up with a solution in New Hampshire and then apply it to Michigan. It's just not going to play out. Likewise, what we're seeing now, in terms of how people are doing adaptation, much of it still is in their comfort zone. It's really, using techniques like restoration, certainly ecological forestry, that, yes, we're increasing ecosystem complexity, but much of that is being done within kind of the comfort zone of the historic range of variation, both in terms of ecosystem conditions, but also in their management experience. And so we really are seeing kind of less willingness currently for managers to go into these more dramatic directions as it relates to transition. And so from a science standpoint, there's a real need for us to understand what's the feasibility of these transition strategies, how do they fit into kind of the broader landscape, but really doing it in a way that thinks about the context in which they're being deployed. And so again, I'm not talking about clear cutting northern hardwood forests and then planting red oak and bitternut hickory and shortleaf pine. Integrating these transition actions into kind of the broader context as a way to increase their functional linkages, as well as to provide key bridges from a management perspective into thinking about adaptation more deliberately. And so as we unfortunately keep approaching more and more undesirable thresholds, and as we see more and more insects and diseases that certainly pay Deb and many others bills in terms of what we do for research, there's going to be more and more emphasis placed on how do we kind of manage for these novel stressors and what can we use for kind of examples of transition that have been people that they get to have the fun and be out in the woods and measure trees. And many people have supported this work over the years. And I will stop there for any questions that folks have.
That was incredible. What you can't hear is the sound of 20 muted people clapping wildly.
Snoring, I think.
So I haven't been on some of these Zoom seminars, but I think it's been working okay to have folks just unmute and ask questions, or feel free to type in the chat window if you'd like, unless you're going to make the recovering silviculturist ask the first question.
That's right. There's even STEM maps in there, Emily.
I know. I got really excited. Did you know, actually, Tony, that Paul Cloco and I had a baby on the same day?
Nice. Silviculture lab. It's a cohort.
All right. Who's got questions?
So this is Deb, and I have a question.
Hey, Deb.
That was a really nice seminar, Tony. You covered a ton of information there. I'm glad it's going to be recorded because I had a couple of grad students out in the field today, and we'll have a little viewing party later on. I'm interested in black ash, much like you, and I was wondering, what are the factors, do you think, that are limiting the survival of the seedlings that you've tried to establish in some of those black ash forests? Is it the frost problem? Is it deer? Is it something that can be overcome, or something that's going to maybe relax as winters get warmer and shorter? What do you think there?
It's a great question. And I think one of the things I didn't bring up in terms of dealing with these novel stressors is, as you know, it's like when people talk about managing lowlands, often it's like you stay away from them or you manage for the species that currently exist there. And so one of the key limitations for a lot of these plantings is just the stock availability. And so in the black ash work, I would actually put a major caveat in there, in that, that's the survival of species from the stock type we could find, which largely was containerized stock. And I think from other work, we actually have side-by-side stock comparisons with some work with Wisconsin DNR. It seems like large bare root stock, if you can get it for some of those native species, there's actually much higher survival. And so I think, the jury's still out to some degree on what does or does not work in those black ash stands. But I think at least some of what we're seeing with the poor survival with red maple as a species, I think a lot of folks thought would do much better. And it's actually held steady. It didn't do well initially, but it's actually held quite steady since some pretty initial high rates of mortality, and also balsam poplar. I think, future work looking at enrichment planting, trying to bring in more bare root stock, and Greg Edge, who I know, they've generated a nice kind of laundry list, kind of a wish list for lowland reforestation for Wisconsin, just kind of showing these are all great species in theory, but no nursery produces this species, or they only produce one form or only one provenance. And so I think going forward with black ash, there just might be a need for just looking at more options out there. And I know we didn't include silver maple and bur oak and some other species like that, and I know those have done well in some plantings up in the peninsula of Michigan. So I think the jury's still out a bit, but what has been comforting, I guess, is that swamp white oak has done well beyond our studies, which makes me, I'm still nervous to say it's going to be the solution, but it looks like it's done well in a couple other places. But I think there's still a need to explore that a bit more with trying different stock types within species to truly say yes or no for a given species in these black ash swamps.
Yeah, well, that'll be interesting. There's a lot of people interested in restoration now, and be good to follow up. Next year will be 9 years, and then 10 years, and so on. So
yeah, and what we've seen, I guess, one final point on that is balsam poplar, because it's so cheap. It's just reproduced by cuttings in a lot of areas that had that heavy black ash decline in the early 2000s. Prior to EAB being the thing people worried about. They've had some success, reforesting those areas with balsam poplar cuttings. It's kind of a cheap way to get trees growing back on those sites. And I know that we've seen pretty high success of that species in the areas where we clear cut the ash and try to simulate kind of a preemptive harvest. So that seems like a pretty good one, at least in that landscape, for kind of restoration of at least tree cover in some of those spots.
So not to hog the questions here, but just one more follow-up. Where we've been doing our surveys mostly in northern lower and a little bit in the UP, the black ash region can be incredibly dense. When you did those seedlings, did you control the black ash region?
So we kind of felt like, because I viewing it not from an entomology perspective, I thought we did control locally some, because black ash doesn't know that it's threatened by EAB. It's resprouting and doing its thing. But in some cases, we actually took advantage of the fact that something could grow back, because on those sites, as you know, they're a bit more kind of large depositional wetlands, and so they get pretty swampy once the trees were cut. So at least having something resprouting and transpiring besides the shrubs, we felt was actually a positive, just to kind of help buffer along those other seedlings as they're growing on the site. But we did go back into those clear-cut areas this past, I guess, 2 years ago now, and did some competition control as well to kind of see how that influenced things. And for us, it's the graminoid competition, like the grasses early on, were really a big challenge, as you know, too. So.
Right. Yeah, we'll have to talk, because we don't see any sprouting to speak of. It's all seed coming up.
Cool.
Yeah. Thank you, Tony.
No problem, Dad. Good hearing from you.
Hey, Tony, can you hear me?
I can, yeah.
Hi, this is Evan Farinosi, the grad student under Mike Walters.
Hey, Evan.
Hey, I had just a quick follow-up to what Deb just asked. As far as mechanisms for mortality, you just mentioned stock type and maybe provenance issues for the lowland stuff. I'm more interested in the New England site.
Yep.
So what were the mechanisms that you see mostly for those range, particularly those range expansion species?
So two primary mechanisms I mentioned, we keep hoping the area that we're working in is a snow bowl. It's, similar to there's really good snowpack there. And so, the first year that we planted, we felt like even like American chestnut, which has got documented, winter injury sensitivities. We felt, it's buried in snow, it's going to be insulated. And so in places where we had lower snowpack, or actually last year we had a really low snowpack year, we started to see a bit more kind of just freezing injury as being kind of the biggest impact on those. And like bitternut hickory was pretty impressive. It's able to resprout and kind of recover from that. But some of the other species, that was all it took to kill them. So it was kind of a cold tolerance issue. There was also, as I mentioned, just the planting conditions. Even though red oak and black birch should be happy ultimately in a warmer climate, they're not psyched as a seedling to get thrown out into that out of the gate. And so we planted both 1 acre and quarter acre openings as part of those experiments, and particularly in those 1 acre openings, where it was just freshly cut, there was definitely like sun scald and some issues. It didn't necessarily lead to mortality, but there was definitely quite a bit of vigor decline as well. But I guess if I was to give you one, the most common is winter injury on those trees. And so you're kind of, as I mentioned, in this tricky situation where you're trying to push the range based on like long-term projections, but you're still going to have, even think about the polar vortex years over the past decade in the lake states and here, in the Northeast, like all it takes is one of those years. And, that ceiling is, you could knock out a whole population of red oak or tulip poplar or whatever you're trying to plant north of its range.
Sure. Yeah. Yep. So obviously I've had some email correspondence with you about species like that. And it's just intriguing with the idea of losing snowpack, right? But not losing freezing soil temperatures. It's really a tough, 50-year window if things actually are going to go the way that we think they're going to go for actually trying to move species around.
It is, and what's kind of nice is we didn't, if Lewis ever gets access to this recording, we didn't listen to the tree atlas when it comes to red spruce. And all of tree atlas is a pretty broad scale projection, and it's great work, but it doesn't factor in like all the nuance of local site and so forth. And so red spruce is a species that actually been recovering quite dramatically in the region over the past half century. And this part of New England's like so it's like the western edge of the Acadian region, so it's very wet, and so we included that as part of our plantings. And to your point, what we get for precip now, like wet falls, kind of less rain, more less snow, more rain. In some cases, it's kind of playing to the physiology of that species a bit. Obviously, it likes to have a snowpack covering its root system, but
right,
it right now seems to be, it's pretty impressive even in a few years what those seedlings have done compared to what's supposed to be the future of that forest.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for the talk. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no, thanks for your questions. Nice hearing from you.
All right, we're a little past time. So I hesitate to even say this, but Tony is really, really fantastic at email. So I think if folks do have additional questions, please feel free to follow up with him. And Tony, thank you so much amidst the end of the semester and Zoom fatigue for joining us today. It was
no problem, Emily. Thanks for the invite and good to connect with many of you.
All right. Take care, everybody.
Take care, everybody. See you.